There's an expression that I read today when I was going through the internet, looking at the free format fighting systems of the mixed martial arts. And it's an expression that I've heard for many years, and I've never loved it. And it generally comes from somebody who wants to sound like the smartest guy in the room that has no evidence or proof of what he's talking about. And that expression is that the sport is in its infancy. No further thought is given today, and no further thought was given in 1995 when I heard it for the very first time. But the sport is in its infancy here in 2020. It is just beginning. Okay, whatever that's supposed to mean, but let's break that apart, because if that's true, then you're telling me guys from 20 years ago simply could not compete today with their skill set. You wouldn't be wrong in large part. The sport is evolving as the strategies are, but a lot of that has to do with the rules that have also come in over time. Many could argue that Royce Gracie's style back in 1993, if the rules were the same today, particularly meaning there was no time limits, and more specifically, there was no rounds, there was not going to be a break positionally every 5 minutes for a 60-second rest and a drink of water. I mean, don't forget, nobody gets anything out of that 60-second break. That drink of water means nothing. That ice you see go on the neck or the instruction from the corner has absolutely nothing to do. What do you think? The corner's not giving instruction while the fight is going on? There's a reason they're all raspy at the end of the night. It's because they're shouting the entire time. That entire break is given to change the positional architecture that was established between the athletes. So you could make an argument that Royce Gracie's style will simply never know the answer. We just simply will never see fights anymore that don't have that positional transition every 5 minutes as a built-in mechanism. But if you're having those arguments and you were right that the sport is at its infancy, then by default, nobody that was competing 20 years ago could step in today. Because it was in its infancy 7 years after it began, then certainly that would be well outdated yet another 20 years later. I don't know that that would be completely true. There are some styles that have never gone away. If you look at the style of Randy Couture, that is one that has transcended time. The very first time they set up that cage in 1993 till now, if you take a guy down and begin to pummel him with strikes, you're going to win. That style and strategy has never not worked. Go see Khabib Nurmagomedov, and there may be some new intricacies to that. And there'd be some different traps and holds and even ways to get a guy there. But as far as throwing somebody down, getting top position, and beginning to strike with fists and elbows, that's never gone out of style. I would argue a Dan Henderson type as well, somebody with great wrestling ability that had very good strikes on their feet. Chuck Liddell would fall into that same category. There are a number of athletes whose style never expired. That clock never ran out, where they refused to learn and they refused to evolve and they refused to see that it was important to have stand-up, the in-between known as wrestling, and of course the submission, offense, and defense on the ground. And then you also need to get into the athleticism part of it, which just has to do with being explosive, with having the right mindset, being able to walk out in front of a crowd half naked and compete, operate within the time constraints, sometimes 3 5-minute rounds, sometimes 5 5-minute rounds, which is a vastly different atmosphere that on any given night drawn out of a hat, you're going to fall into one of those two categories. I mean, there's a lot of things that go into it. But there is a number of guys who, if you look back and think that their style wouldn't transcend, and therefore I'm not going to study and watch them, you would miss. Randy's style never went out. He just turned 47 years old. Dan Henderson's style never went out. He turned 46 years old. That style still worked, though. I think that Anderson Silva, George St. Pierre will be more fine examples. Did those guys evolve from 2000 till now? Sure. Did they evolve at the same rate or rapidly as maybe some other guys? No, but they also couldn't. They were very ahead of the curve way back in 2000. People began studying them, trying to catch them. They were the bar. That is what the parameters were. And if you do watch some of those guys, George, Anderson, I would argue Chuck, I think that Chuck, why he didn't get to the same age of Randy or Dan, it was still just an issue of slowing down, which just came with time. Many of those styles would work today. Many of those styles are still emulated today. But if you are going to be a student of the sport, a coach of the sport, that wants to take what they've learned along the way and pass that to the next generation, and you turn your nose at something because it was done 20 years ago and you're a believer in this whole infancy process, if any part of that was true, if you're one of those, not the infancy of the sport, shut up. Just shut up with that. But you would be the same kind of prick that would come along and tell us how great Bruce Lee was. Bruce Lee, who had never fought competitively once, by rumor had done it once. A rumor that I believe to be true, that I've even seen footage of. That footage has been broken down, that was no more than a choreographed Hollywood scene, much closer to pro wrestling. But if we are to accept that one match, which I personally do, but you're going to anoint Bruce Lee, who had never done it, who laid out philosophies as far back as 1969, but you're not going to look at the world champions from the years 2000 and on, because they were doing it at a time before the sport had evolved, because it's within its infancy. You, my friend, are a doofus.